there was this great secondhand bookshop around the corner that had paperbacks for prices broke graduate students can afford. And I ended up, especially during the summer when I was procrastinating on my, dissertation, reading John Dickson Carr, and have been interested in him ever since. When I decided not much over a decade ago to finish collecting, I didn't have all of his books, and read or reread Carr, and I went to the shelf, I confirmed something which was a compliment to Carr, but not to me, which was he was my least returned author. So I had fewer books, and again, they were paperbacks, right, than I had purchased. And then I realized, oh, I'm a grown-up, I have a paycheck. So I decided to start collecting Carr in first printings, unabridged, just the way the books first appeared, which for me is an exciting thing. People collect books for different reasons. One of the reasons I collect favorites in first printings is because it's a little bit like going back in time and experiencing exactly the way people did when a book first came into print. It's a scary, long, and expensive path. Carr is actually very difficult to collect even all his works in first printings. And the more so if you're ambitious of having beautiful copies in the original dust jackets, just the way you might have seen them on the shelf starting in 1930, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, because he published all those decades. And so there probably aren't a lot of us out there who have even a complete run of first printings. For example, 2 of his books were published under pseudonyms, one, I think, in 1934, under a pseudonym called Roger Fairborn. It's virtually impossible to find. And when I finally, I think it was 2016, found a copy, the joke among collectors is that, this and the other one I'll mention show up about once every 10 years and they cost $1,000 and you just hold your nose and buy them because you're lucky to find them at all. I shared on social media, I was so excited. This was my penultimate acquisition. I was just missing these 2 books. And I said, I finally got Devil Kinsmere. And I posted a copy of the book. And Otto Penzler, who is a social media friend and in real life, dryly commented back. He said, well, why did you photograph it without the dust jacket? It's like unheard of in the dust jacket. He was just kind of rubbing in the difference between a copy in bare cloth and a first-rate copy that actually looks like when it was published. The other one was also published under his most frequently used pseudonym, which is Carter Dickson. But it was a 1937 paperback novella published only in the UK by Hodder and Stoughton. So, you can figure out what happened to paperbacks, most of them published in 1937 in London. There are not a lot of them that survive. And the crazy part of this story, I did eventually find it, was that I found it just through a chain of referrals among collectors. There was a collector in China who had the absurd good fortune to have 2 of them. And he didn't know how to price it, and I didn't know how to price it because it comes up for sale very, very rarely. So, but we managed to make a deal and he sent it over to me. But the irony is I had the good fortune later to acquire a nicer copy of the same book. So now I was in that relatively absurd position and I ended up selling it to another collector. Those 2 books, so by the way, the title of that book is The Third Bullet. Those 2 books are very, very difficult for collectors of Carr to find. And so those are special stories to me because they were the last 2 books so that I had a complete run of first printings for John Dickson Carr. Well, the Haverford ones were the easiest. All of us interested in John Dickson Carr, whether we're reading him or writing about him, are entirely indebted to and sitting on the shoulders of Doug Green. And I'm not saying that because he's the founder and first publisher for Crippen and Landru, although he happens to be, but because, of course, he's Carr's authorized biographer, and he was the right person in the right place at the right time to capture so much information about Carr that would have been lost, including listings of all Carr's amateur publications. So at the end of 1921, he published a story, and then he published amateur stories all the way through 1929. That's still a relatively brief period. We're talking essentially about stories he wrote between the ages of 16 and 22, not much more than that, and his progress. But Doug Green had, of course, captured the fact that these stories existed. I was very interested in finding copies of those for myself just to read. I had gone out on my own, and some industrious person had put entire scans, not focused on John Dickson Carr, but just to preserve the Haverfordian. Those I basically was able to find just working search. And when you're collecting books or you're doing a research project like this, what they all have in common is a concept I think of as pounding sand. You know, there's just a lot of futility of looking places, asking 100 times, 500 times, and hearing no, 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 and finally one time yes. But the Haverfordian stuff, because somebody had been thoughtful about the electronic preservation of these, they were easy. Now, the stories at the Hill, his prep school, and the stories at Uniontown High School, ones that I had to go get copies for myself that weren't otherwise available electronically anywhere. I contacted the Hill, and they had an excellent research librarian there who was super friendly. I don't have permission to mention anybody's names, so I won't, but that person with relatively little difficulty, as long as I provided correct information and checking things, managed to put me fully in possession of excellent copies of all the stories published in the Hill Record. So that left his high school stories. His high school still had a bound copy of the 1921 school newspaper or publication in which that story appeared. I was aware of, and they reinforced that there's a special materials, right, special collections at the public library there in Uniontown. And I got in touch with them. Lucky for me, the query came to the attention of another librarian there who did not find the materials. You know who found them? A volunteer. So somebody, right, high motor, interested in obscure questions, got me those last two stories. So it took a couple of inquiries and 3 there, but I would generally speaking recommend without qualification, most strongly, always ask research librarians for assistance. They are so knowledgeable about their collections. They're passionate to help people who are passionate about materials. Not to give an overbroad answer, but in a sense, I really learned how he became the author he is. You know, we understand John Dickson Carr through the lens of the golden age of detection. He is one of the acknowledged masters in that interwar period of the fair play mystery, of the miracle crime, and his journey to becoming that author is wildly interesting. I'm serious, wildly interesting. We've uncovered probably 3 dozen authors that Carr named who were of interest and influence, varying degrees of influence upon him when he basically was thinking about becoming an author. I mean, the conventional understanding of Carr is that his literary ancestors are Edgar Allan Poe and G.K. Chesterton and Arthur Conan Doyle. And these 3 are indeed important literary ancestors of Carr, but they are really just a sliver. And when you begin to understand what the young Carr was reading, and you look at what he was writing, the least successful stories he wrote as an amateur author are his mystery stories. He wrote historical stories. He wrote adventure stories. He wrote romances. He wrote in a variety of styles, basically trying them all out, seeing what interested him. From story to story, the improvement and the variety in subject matter, and not just the improvement in his writing style, the improvement in his technique, his perspicacity as an author, from story to story, you get to see him grow up. And when you really understand what he was reading and have the luxury of reading it, you find these direct influences you never suspected. But there's this really incredible journey as he tries on different kinds of literature, and as he gains strength from story to story, very quickly learning what he did well and where he needs improvement, and just making these leaps forward in as little as one story to the next. And you can see the improvement certainly from one year to the next. John Dickson Carr was a writer grounded in the traditions of previous authors and literary movements, not just casually sampling them, but deep commitments to them. And I'm being vague about that because readers of this book from Crippen and Landry will have the pleasure, I hope the pleasure, of reading an extended literary critical essay that lays all this out explicitly. Who were John Dickson Carr's literary ancestors? What literary traditions as a young developing author were important to him? And how did he turn from that into one of the really great masters of the golden age of detection? And as remarkable as Doug's biography is, it can only spend a chapter on the young John Dickson Carr. And here we have the opportunity not just to spend a book-length amount of material commenting on these stories specifically in his development and as an author, but we get to pair that critical analysis with each of 10 representative stories that show just who he was story to story and year to year. So very exciting. And I hope it will be for readers too.